Welcome. I'm Bruce Munro. With me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. The Brexit train continues to hurtle towards the station. Politicians in the United Kingdom and the European Union are trying to delay the inevitable collision by moving the station further down the track. UK Prime Minister Theresa May has sought and has been granted a time extension on the date by which the UK needs to leave the EU. Welcome, Robert.
Good morning, Bruce.
This Brexit time extension, how important is it?
I think it's very important. I think it changed the dynamics of the Brexit crisis in a sense. But I think from Mrs May's point of view, this incentivises her talks with Mr Corbyn. And in a sense, I think she'll be anxious to come up with what she would see as a compromise deal with Mr Corbyn. Mr Corbyn wants Britain to remain part of the customs union. The danger for both parties, however, is that the Brexiteers on the Tory side will reject a softening of the Brexit departure. And on Mr Corbyn's side, the majority of his MPs actually want to remain in the EU. So it seems to me that both, even for compromise deals put together in this new revised time frame, it's unlikely to fly with both parties. In fact, it could fracture both parties, which of course then leaves the option, leaves on the table other options that both parties will have to consider.
Brexit's been grinding along for 2 years. Why should anyone here in New Zealand, apart from the likes of you and me, give a toss what actually happens?
It's a very good question, but there are important historical and economic links between New Zealand and the United Kingdom. Historically, of course, there is a long association between the two countries, and economically, New Zealand, Britain and the EU are both important partners for New Zealand. So I think the EU is the third or fourth largest trading partner of this country in terms of our export destinations. And why does it matter? Because if the UK left the EU, that would complicate New Zealand's export strategy in Europe. It would mean, for example, if the UK left the EU single market, that many companies in this country would want to retain access to both, but that would involve tough choices. For the bigger companies like Fonterra, they could probably keep a foot in both the Britain and the EU, but for smaller companies, which nevertheless have important export businesses in Europe, it would mean perhaps choosing between the two. And of course, most smaller companies, if they had to establish a base in Europe, would rather do it in a market where there's 520 million, where there's only a market of 65 million. So it is disruptive for people, many New Zealand companies, and it does have some negative effects.
I want to take you back to comments you've made before regarding the original Brexit referendum. You said it was illegal, that there was evidence of Russian interference and financial irregularities that may have swayed the outcome of the referendum. Yes. Nobody seems to be taking much notice of that. What does that say about the state of global politics?
I wouldn't say they're not taking too much notice of it. What's happening is the rest of the world, if not Britain, is taking note of it. And there have been some extraordinary developments recently. Firstly, on the 21st of February, Sir James Eadie, a lawyer for the government, admitted in open court that Mrs Thatcher knew full well the illegalities of the 2016 referendum, data crime, and other irregularities of the 2016 referendum. This was an extraordinary admission. And then, on the 29th of March, we had the Leave EU camp, which had been challenging the £70,000 fine that was handed out to it by the UK Electoral Commission. It shelved its challenge, which was an admission of guilt. Then, in the last week, we've had an extraordinary documentary by SDF, one of the major German TV networks, which covers in quite considerable detail the sort of things we've just discussed, as well as the fact the leading donor to the Leave side, Mr Aaron Banks, who donated somewhere between 8 and 12 million, the biggest donor in British political history, that cannot seem to adequately account for where he got this money. And in addition, the fact is he's under investigation, albeit at a glacial pace, by the National Crime Agency. So I think, to answer your question, Bruce, there is a mounting consciousness that all is not well with the way in which the referendum was conducted.
And can I ask, so what does this tell us about the state of politics in the world?
Well, I think it tells us that basically countries that New Zealand had looked to in the past to uphold rules of law, the rule of law, and all the essential ingredients of a liberal democracy are beginning to slip on their standards. As you know, a Canadian academic, Professor David Welsh, and myself have on a number of occasions urged New Zealand and Canada to speak out about this. If you see a country which has a historically close association with this one, and for that matter from Canada, and you see them falling beneath those standards, it's incumbent on friends to speak out. And it's a dangerous situation where leading politicians in a country like Britain say, unless people are prepared to accept the referendum result with all its features, such as illegal spending by up to the tune of 10%, data crime, and possible Russian interference, unless British people are prepared to accept that, then there's always going to be divisions. Well, to me, it seems to be saying that the leading figures in the British government seem to be saying that cheating is okay. And that's not acceptable for a liberal democracy like New Zealand. So I think there are some big issues at stake which transcend the UK, certainly have raise big issues for us. We see ourselves as a good international citizen, and so far we've remained very quiet on these issues. But as the awful events of Christchurch have reminded us 4 weeks ago, we are interconnected with the rest of the world. And it's important that we play our part in trying to speak out on such issues.
Thanks, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Ka kite anō.